Welcome to Grandpa Explains. Tonight, we are going to slow down together, you and I, and spend some time inside one of the most beautiful ideas anyone has ever had about what you are. Not what you do, not what you own, not the face you show the world when the sun is up. What you actually are, underneath all of it. We are going to walk very gently through the mind as a man named Carl Gustav Jung once imagined it, and by the time we are done, if we get done at all before you drift off, you may feel as though you have wandered through the rooms of your own house in the dark and found that every one of them was already familiar. You do not need to know anything about psychology to listen. You do not need to remember a single word. There is nothing to figure out tonight, nowhere else to be, no test in the morning. If your mind wanders off somewhere in the middle, that is perfectly fine. That is, in a way, exactly the point. Let it wander. I will keep talking, and you can come and go as you please. Before we begin, if you feel like it, you might leave a little note and tell me what time it is, where you are, and where in this wide world you happen to be lying tonight. A city, a small town, a room with the window cracked open. I always like to imagine the places. Someone listening with the rain coming down. Someone where it is already past 2 in the morning. Someone just home from a long shift, finally horizontal at last. We are all in our own beds, scattered across the dark side of the earth, and yet here we are together for a little while. Now, take a slow, deep breath. In through the nose if you can, all the way down, and then let it go without any hurry, like a tide sliding back from the sand. And another, slower still, let your shoulders come down from wherever they have been holding themselves all day. Let your jaw loosen. Wherever you are, let yourself settle in. The day is over. You did what you could with it, and now it is allowed to be finished. Thank you for joining us here at Grandpa Explains. Let us begin. The man we are spending the evening with was born in 1875 in Switzerland, and he died in 1961, an old man by then, having spent his whole long life staring into the same question, the way some people spend their lives staring at the sea. Carl Gustav Jung, a Swiss psychiatrist and psychoanalyst, and the founder of what came to be called analytical psychology. That phrase, analytical psychology, simply means his own particular way of taking the mind apart and looking at the pieces gently to see how they fit together. We will come back to his name and his life here and there as we go, the way you mention an old friend in passing. But tonight, he is mostly our guide, walking ahead of us with a lamp, showing us the rooms. And the very first thing he would tell you if you sat across from him in his study with the fire low is this: the mind is not a thing, it is a place, and it is much, much larger than you think. So let us begin with the place. Picture a great house at night, not a frightening house, an old, settled, comfortable house, the kind that has stood a long time and seen many lives pass through it. It has many rooms, more rooms than anyone living there has ever counted. Wings you have never opened, a staircase going down that you half remember and half do not, and it is night, deep night, the same kind of night you are lying in right now, and the whole house is dark. Every room is dark. The furniture is there, the pictures on the walls are there, the long hallways are there, but you cannot see any of it because there is no light. Except in one room. In one single room, a lamp is burning. A warm, small, steady lamp, the kind with a soft yellow glow that only reaches so far before it gives up and lets the shadows have the rest. And in that one lit room, sitting in the circle of lamplight, is someone who says a particular word over and over all day long. The word is I. I am thinking this. I want that. I remember yesterday. I am tired tonight. That lit room, Jung said, is what he called the ego. Now hold that word lightly because it does not mean here what you might have heard it mean elsewhere. When people say someone has a big ego, they usually mean he is vain or arrogant, full of himself. That is not what Jung meant at all. For Jung, the ego is something much simpler and much more important than that. The ego is the center of the field of consciousness. It is the part of you that is awake. It is the part that knows it is you and not somebody else, the part that carries your sense of being one continuous person from the morning you woke up as a child to this very night. It is the I at the middle of the lamplight. When you say I, it is the ego speaking. It is the one sitting in the lit room. And here is the whole secret of the evening, the thing the entire house is built to show you. That lit room is only one room. The ego is the center of consciousness, yes. But it is not the whole house. It is not even most of the house. It is one warm, small, lit room in a great dark mansion of rooms, and almost everything you are is out there in the dark. In all the other chambers, the lamplight never reaches. Sit with that for a moment because it is a strange and freeing thing to consider as you lie there. The part of you that worries, the part that plans, the part that narrates your day to you in a quiet inner voice, the part that is, perhaps, even now wondering, whether it will manage to fall asleep tonight. All of that busy, talking, anxious I, all of that is just the one lit room. It feels like the whole of you because it is the only part that can see itself. The lamp can only light up what stands inside its glow. It cannot light up the rest of the house. So the ego, sitting there in the warm circle, looks around at what it can see and very naturally assumes that this is everything. This room is the house. This lamplight is the world. But it is not. And Jung's whole gentle life's work was to walk out through that doorway, lamp in hand, into the rest of the rooms, and to map them one by one the way a kind old surveyor walks a piece of land he loves and draws it carefully so others can find their way. So already there is a small, soft question hanging in the dark, and we will let it pull us forward without any urgency at all. If the I you call yourself is only one lit room, then who lives in all the others? Let us change the picture for a moment because Jung liked more than one, and so do I. Sometimes the house is easier to feel as water. Picture instead a small island in a very wide sea. The island is where you live in the daylight. It is dry land, solid under your feet, the place where you stand and look around and say, "This is me, this is my life, here are my days." That little island, sunlit, ringed with a beach you know well. That is the ego again, the conscious self, the part that is awake. And it feels, when you are standing on it, like the whole world. Because from the island all you can see is the island and the bright surface of the water stretching out flat in every direction. But the island is only the top of something. Go to the edge where the sand slopes down into the shallows and wade out a little, and the bottom drops away beneath your feet. Down there, just below the bright surface, in the near depths where the light still reaches and the water is green and dim, lies the first of the great dark layers Jung wanted to show us. He called it the personal unconscious. The personal unconscious is your own near water. It is everything that was once up on the island, up in the lamplight, conscious and known to you, and then, for one reason or another, slipped down below the surface. Some of it simply sank because you forgot it. The face of a teacher you had when you were 7, the smell of a kitchen in a house you no longer live in, 1,000 small things that were once perfectly clear to you and are now down there in the dim green water, not gone, just no longer lit. And some of it went down not because you forgot it, but because you pushed it under. things you did not want to look at. A shame, a hurt, a wish you were not proud of, a moment you would rather not have lived. You took those and you pressed them down beneath the surface where the island could not see them. That pushing down has a name, repression, and it simply means the mind quietly setting something out of sight because looking at it was too much. And there is a third kind of thing in those near depths, subtler than the others. The things you perceived but never quite noticed. Jung called them subliminal perceptions, which is a large phrase for a small, ordinary thing. It means all the impressions that brushed against you below the level of your attention. The look on a stranger's face that you registered without knowing you registered it. The change in someone's voice. The detail your eye caught while your mind was busy elsewhere. Your senses take in far more than your lamplit eye ever notices, and all of that overflow slides down quietly into the near water and settles there. So the personal unconscious is, in a way, the whole of your own life, the part of it that is no longer in the light. It is particular to you. No one else has your sunken things. Your near water is yours alone, fed by your own forgotten days and your own pressed down moments and your own unnoticed glances. This first layer, Jung was always honest to say, was not entirely his discovery. There had been another man before him who mapped this near water carefully, and we will meet that man gently later in the night. But for now, it is enough to know that just below the bright island, the floor drops away, and there in the dim green deep lie all the things of your life that the lamp no longer shows. And it is so much more than you remember. That is the quiet wonder of it. You walk around all day on your little island thinking you are the island, and the whole time, hung in the water just beneath you, is a vastness, a slow green archive of everything you ever were, breathing softly in the dark. Let us pause here for a moment. Take a slow, deep breath. Let it out even more slowly than you took it in. Notice, if you like, the simple fact of the bed beneath you holding you up, asking nothing. Notice how the air feels coming in cool and going out warm. There is nowhere you need to go. The house is dark and quiet and you are safe in your one lit room, and the great mansion all around you means you no harm. It is only the rest of yourself waiting patiently in the dark. And when you are ready, in no hurry at all, we will continue together. Now, let us go back down into the near water, the personal unconscious, because it is not, it turns out, just a smooth green floor of sunken odds and ends, all loose and scattered. Jung looked closer and he found that the sunken things do not lie there at random. They gather, they clump together. Things that share a feeling drift toward one another in the dark and form little clusters, little knots, the way iron filings gather around a magnet you cannot see. He had a word for these knots. He called them complexes. Now you have heard that word. It has slipped out of his study and into ordinary speech, so that today people say someone has a complex about their height, or an inferiority complex, or a mother complex, without ever knowing that the word came to them, more or less, from this one quiet Swiss man and the work he did in a particular clinic over 100 years ago. So let us slow down and let Jung tell us what he actually meant, because it is gentler and stranger than the everyday use lets on. A complex is an emotionally charged cluster of ideas and images all organized around a single core theme. That is the whole definition, and it is worth turning over slowly. A cluster, a clump of ideas and images, the way a seed pearl gathers layer on layer around one tiny grain, and the grain at the center, the core theme, is some feeling-laden thing. Mother, perhaps, or failure, or being left. Around that one charged center, over a lifetime, all the related memories and images and old hurts and old hopes drift in and stick, until you have a dense little knot down there in the near water. glowing faintly with feeling, organized, whole, almost like a small separate self. And here is where it becomes wonderful, and where we get to leave the world of pure picture and stand for a moment on solid, measured, real ground. Because this is not just a poetic notion Jung dreamed up by the fire. He found the complexes. He measured them with a stopwatch. Picture this very calmly. A young man, Jung himself, not yet famous, working in the early years of his career at a clinic in Zürich called the Burghölzli, a real place, a psychiatric clinic, where he worked under an older psychiatrist named Eugen Bleuler. And at the Burghölzli, the young Jung ran a kind of experiment, very simple on its face, that came to be called the word association experiment. It went like this. He would sit a person down calmly and he would say a single word out loud, an ordinary word, table or water or mother or money. And the person was asked to answer at once with the very first word that came into their mind. Table, the person might say, and then chair, water, and then cold. Simple, easy, quick. And all the while, Jung sat there with a stopwatch. He was timing them, measuring the little gap between the word he said and the word they answered. And for most words, the gap was tiny, a fraction of a moment, the answer rising up easily and lightly. But every so often, with a certain word, something would happen. The person would stumble, the answer would not come. There would be a delay, a long, strange pause, a fraction of a second, too long, sometimes much longer. Or they would laugh nervously, or they would repeat the word back, buying time, or they would forget afterward what they had even answered. Some particular word, harmless to look at, would land on them and snag, and the smooth surface of their answering would catch and tear. And that snag, Jung realized, was the complex. That word had touched the grain at the center of one of those hidden clusters down in the near water, and the cluster had reached up, just for an instant, and disturbed the surface. But he did not only watch the stopwatch, he watched the body. Because more than the mind betrays a complex, the body does too. He measured, among other things, what is called the galvanic skin response, which sounds like a great deal but means something quite small and human. It is simply this. When we feel something, even a little, even without knowing we feel it, the skin changes, it grows very faintly damp, the tiny sweat of feeling. And that faint dampness changes how easily a small electrical current passes across the skin, and that change can be measured with a sensitive instrument. So Jung, in the Burghölzli, could say a word and watch the stopwatch catch the delay, and at the very same instant watch the needle on his instrument swing as the person's own skin, without their knowing it, quietly betrayed them. He watched their breathing change too, the breath catching or quickening when a charged word came. The whole body would flinch in its quiet way. Around a wound the conscious eye did not even know it was carrying. Sit with that for a moment, because it is rather extraordinary and rather tender. A man sits across from you and says a simple word, and your face stays calm and your eye, up in the lit room, feels nothing in particular, and yet down below the surface a hidden knot has stirred, and your skin grows faintly damp and your breath catches, and a needle swings, and there, on a roll of paper, is the proof of a self you did not know was down there. I want to pause on that gently, because there is something important in it that quietly corrects a story you may have heard about Jung. People sometimes paint him as a mystic, a dreamer, a man who saw visions and talked of ancient symbols and had no feet on the solid ground at all. And it is true that he went to strange and deep places, and we will go to some of them later tonight. But it is worth knowing as you lie there that this whole great map of the mind began here, on the most solid ground there is, with a young man and a stopwatch and an instrument and a needle patiently measuring the body as it told the truth the mind was keeping secret. The complex is not a fairy story. It was measured. It left marks on paper. That is the quiet, sturdy foundation under all the deeper rooms we will visit. And once Jung had found these clusters and measured them, he noticed something about them that is the strangest and most beautiful idea in this whole first stretch of our journey. He noticed that the complexes have a life of their own. They are not just dead clumps lying still in the dark. They behave, he said, with a degree of autonomy. That word autonomy just means self-ruling, acting on its own, moving by its own will, rather than yours. The complexes act sometimes on their own. They can rise up all by themselves and intrude on what the lit room intended. You sit down meaning to be calm and something stirs, and suddenly there is a mood on you that you did not choose and cannot explain, a heaviness, an irritation, a sudden ache, and you say, "I do not know what came over me." Something came over you, a knot down in the water reached up and touched the lamplight, or a word slips out of your mouth that you did not mean to say, and you hear it land and you think, where did that come from? It came from one of the splinter selves down in the dark. Jung even called them that, splinter psyches, little broken off pieces of self, each one organized around its own charged core, each one able to act for a moment as though it were a small, separate person living in your house. And he said a thing about them that I want you to carry into your sleep, because it turns the whole everyday way of speaking on its head. And it is, I think, oddly comforting. People say, "I have a complex," as though it were a thing you owned, a possession kept in a drawer. But Jung said it is not really like that at all. It is not so much that we have complexes, he said. It is that the complexes have us. Let that settle softly in the dark. The complexes have us. When the sudden mood takes you, when the old hurt flares up at a small thing, when you find yourself acting in a way the calm, lit eye would never have chosen, it is not you, up in the lamplight, doing it. It is one of the splinter selves risen up out of the near water, taking the wheel for a moment, while the ego sits in its lit room, wondering what on earth just happened. And this is not a thing to fear, lying there in the dark. It is a thing to be gentle with, because every one of those knots, every one of those splinter selves down in the green water was made the same way. Each one formed around some real grain of feeling, some old hurt, or old love, or old fear that was too much to hold up in the light, so it sank and gathered and grew its quiet pearl in the dark. They are not enemies. They are not flaws. They are the places where life touched you hard enough to leave a charged little world behind. And the whole of Jung's gentle work, the whole reason he walked out of the lit room with his lamp, was not to destroy these hidden selves, but to come down to them, slowly, kindly, and get to know them so that they would no longer have to rise up unbidden and take the wheel in the dark. But we are getting ahead of ourselves, and there is no need to hurry. We have only just stepped out of the lit room. We have only just waded down into the near water and found, drifting there, the gathered knots of our own forgotten life, glowing faintly with old feeling, each one a small splinter of self with a will of its own. We have found that the ego is only one lit room in a great dark house, only one small island in a wide sea. And we have found that a young man with a stopwatch once measured all of this, watched the skin grow faintly damp and the breath catch and the needle swing, and proved that the dark is real and patterned and waiting just below where the lamp gives out. Take another slow breath now, in and out even slower. There is nothing you need to do with any of this. You do not have to map your own complexes tonight. You do not have to go down into your own near water. You can simply lie here in your one-lit room, knowing the great house stands all around you in the friendly dark, and rest. Because there is more house to walk. Below the near water, below your own forgotten green deep, the floor drops away again into a far darker and far stranger ocean, one that is not yours alone, one that every person who has ever lived has carried beneath their own small island, inherited, ancient, shared. And there is a stranger inside you who knows the way down to it. I notice this request asks me to continue a narration, but the text, so far, has already moved well past this part's assigned beats. The beats I'm asked to cover are the opening ones, the branded welcome naming Jung, the geo-bait, the breath cue, let us begin, then the house, lit room image, the island, sea image, the first rest pause, and the complex word, association, material, at the Burghölzli clinic. But the provided what you've written so far already contains all of that in the lit room, the island, the sea, the stopwatch and galvanometer, the splinter selves, and it's even gesturing forward toward the collective unconscious, the next part's territory. So a true, seamless continuation would carry into collective unconscious material, which the instructions explicitly tell me not to cover yet, still covering only this part's beats. There's a genuine conflict in the brief. The continuation point and the assigned beats don't line up. Rather than guess, let me flag it and offer the most useful path forward. I can write the 1,000-word continuation, staying inside this part's beats by circling back to deepen the complex word association material. Bleuler, the Burghölzli clinic in Zürich, the delayed reactions, the stumbling complexes have us, splinter psyches, before the text tips over into the collective unconscious, keeping it pre-collective unconscious so I don't poach part 2's beats. That honors both seamless and only this part's beats. Want me to proceed on that basis? If instead you'd prefer I let it flow naturally into the collective unconscious, accepting some overlap with part 2, tell me and I'll write it that way. Just confirm which you'd like. And so let us stay a little longer with the complexes because Jung himself stayed with them a long time. He did not arrive at the idea all at once. It came to him slowly, through the work, through mornings in the clinic, through a stopwatch and a piece of equipment most people today have never held, through watching the body betray what the mind preferred to keep hidden. The Burghölzli psychiatric clinic in Zürich was a serious place. It was not a gentleman's study or a philosopher's retreat. It was a working hospital for people in genuine distress, and Jung arrived there young, in his mid-20s, under the directorship of Eugen Bleuler, a meticulous and demanding psychiatrist who had no patience for vague theorizing. If you wanted to make a claim at the Burghölzli, you had better be able to point to something. You had better have evidence. So Jung looked for evidence, and he found it in the word association test, which was not his invention. Today the test had been used before, but which he transformed into something genuinely revealing. The procedure was simple on its surface. A researcher says a word. The subject says the first word that comes to mind. The researcher marks the time it took, notes anything unusual in the response, and moves to the next word. 100 stimulus words, one after another. It sounds almost like a game. But Jung was not playing a game. He was watching very carefully. He had a stopwatch, a real stopwatch held in the hand, and he was measuring the delay in tenths of a second between the stimulus word and the response. He was also watching breathing patterns, and he had a galvanometer, which is a device that measures tiny changes in the electrical conductivity of the skin, what we now call galvanic skin response, the same signal that forms the basis of the polygraph, the lie detector. When we are emotionally activated, even slightly, even without knowing it, our sweat glands respond. The skin changes, the galvanometer records it. What Jung found was this. For most words, the response came quickly and easily. A word like table, and the subject said chair in a fraction of a second, and the galvanometer stayed quiet. But for certain words, and they were different words for different people, something happened. The delay lengthened. The subject stumbled or said something unexpected, or repeated the stimulus word back, or laughed at nothing in particular. Sometimes they forgot what they had just said. Sometimes the galvanometer moved. Sometimes the breathing shifted. These were not random moments, they clustered. The stimulus words that caused the stumbling were related to each other, connected by a hidden thread. And Jung understood that the thread was emotion. Something emotionally significant lived in that cluster. Something the person had not chosen to put there, had perhaps not even known was there, was nonetheless present. And it was interfering, reaching up through the floor of consciousness and disrupting the simple act of responding to a word. He called these clusters complexes. A complex, in Jung's understanding, is an emotionally charged knot of ideas and images organized around a central theme. It might be organized around the idea of the mother, not any particular thought about her, but a whole constellation of memory and feeling and expectation and fear, all gathered together and weighted with emotion, drawing other associations toward it like a quiet gravitational field. It might be organized around inferiority or power or abandonment or love. The specific content varies from person to person, shaped by individual experience. But the structure, a charged, autonomous cluster that is consistent. Autonomous. That word is the important one. Because Jung observed that these complexes do not simply wait passively to be examined, they act, they push upward, they disturb. The delay in the word association test was a tiny example of this. A complex reaching up and slowing the response, muddying the water for just long enough to betray itself. But in ordinary life, the same thing happens in larger ways. You sit down to write a letter and your hand stops at a certain name. You plan to say something calm and something else comes out sharper than you meant. You enter a room and find yourself irritable without quite knowing why, and only later recognize that something in the room touched something you carry. This is what Jung meant when he said, in a formulation that has stayed with me and perhaps with you, that it is not so much that we have complexes as that complexes have us. We think we are the ones doing the directing. We think we are the ego, the lit room, the clear and purposeful I. But below the floor, those charged clusters have a kind of life, a degree of autonomy. They can behave, Jung said, like splinter psyches. Smaller selves within the self, each with its own emotional center of gravity, its own set of associations, its own preferences about how the world should be arranged. They are not evil. They are not diseases. They are simply parts of us that have gathered around something important and charged, parts that have never quite been brought into the light long enough to be understood, and understanding them, that was the beginning of what Jung thought inner life was actually for. Let us rest here for a moment, for if you are lying down, let yourself feel the weight of the bed beneath you, the mattress or the pillow or the floor. Wherever your body is resting, let it hold you. You do not have to hold yourself right now. Something else is doing that. Take a slow breath in and out. The complexes you carry, whatever they are organized around, whatever emotional knots have gathered in you over years, they are not a sign that something has gone wrong. Everyone at the Burghölzli showed them. Every subject, every word association list for every person contained its stumbling places. The galvanometer moved for everyone. This is simply what it is to be a person who has lived long enough to love and lose and fear and hope. When you are ready, we will continue. Now! The man who was doing all this careful, meticulous galvanometer-holding work in Zürich was not yet 30 when he began. And in the same years, across Europe, another man was working on very similar questions about the unconscious, had written a book that Jung read with something like hunger, had proposed that beneath conscious life lay a whole territory of repressed material that shaped behavior in ways the person could not see. That man was Sigmund Freud. And what happened between them is worth sitting with gently for a few minutes, because it bears on the very map we are tracing tonight. They began around 1907 as something close to father and son. Freud was 50 when Jung was 32. Freud was already famous, already the author of the interpretation of dreams, already the founder of something he called psychoanalysis, already surrounded by a small and intense circle of followers who met weekly in Vienna. Jung was younger, Swiss rather than Viennese, trained in the clinic rather than the consulting room, coming to the conversation with empirical work, the word association experiments, the galvanic skin measurements, that Freud found impressive. Freud had been working largely from case material, from the things his patients told him, from what he observed in the consulting room. Here was a young man bringing actual physical data. Freud valued that. And on the other side, Jung found in Freud a mind that had already journeyed far into the territory that fascinated him, the territory below consciousness, the hidden life that shaped the visible one. They wrote letters, long ones, warm ones. They met in person, and the first meeting reportedly lasted 13 hours, neither of them apparently noticing the time pass. Freud came to regard Jung as exceptionally gifted, as the person best suited to carry the work forward, and he said so directly. He called Jung his crown prince. He spoke of him as his successor, his heir, the one who would lead the new science of the psyche after Freud himself was gone. That is a very large thing to be told, and it carried perhaps a very large weight. For a few years they collaborated, corresponded, and were genuinely important to each other. But beneath the warmth, there were tensions, and by 1912 and 1913, those tensions had become impossible to ignore. The disagreement was, at its core, about the nature of the unconscious itself, about what was down there in the depths below the lit room. Freud believed, or had come to believe, that the unconscious was primarily a repository of repressed material, things pushed down because they were too dangerous or too painful to remain in consciousness. And the primary energy driving that repression, in Freud's understanding, was sexual energy. He called it libido, and for Freud, libido was specifically and centrally sexual. The unconscious, in his view, was largely a sealed cellar of forbidden wishes, many of them erotic, most of them originating in childhood. Jung did not see it that way, not entirely. He agreed that repressed material was there. His own word association work had confirmed that complexes existed, that emotionally charged clusters gathered below the surface. But he could not accept that the unconscious was only that. He could not accept that it was only what had been pushed down, only what was forbidden, only sexuality in the specific sense that Freud meant. And beyond that, Jung had begun to notice something in the material that came from patients, in the imagery and symbols that arose in dreams and breakdowns and disturbed states, something that seemed too old, too consistent across people, too far beyond what any individual life could have produced to be explained as the remnants of that individual's repressed wishes. He was seeing patterns that appeared in people who could not have learned them, images that matched mythologies those people had never studied, themes that ran through disparate minds as though they were threads from a shared loom. He began to suspect there was something below the personal unconscious, something older, something inherited not as memory, but as form. Freud resisted this. For Freud, psychoanalysis had to remain within the empirical and the scientific as he understood it, rooted in the individual, in biography, in sexuality, and its discontents. What Jung was beginning to describe sounded to Freud like mysticism. It sounded like a drift away from the solid clinical ground towards something unprovable and perhaps dangerously close to religion. They broke. By 1912, the letters had cooled, and by 1913, the friendship was over. It was not a quiet parting. Both men felt it as a kind of loss. Jung, by his own later account, passed through a period of profound inner turbulence in the years that followed, something he would eventually come to understand as his own confrontation with the unconscious, his own descent into the depths he had been theorizing about. But what the break left behind, what it clarified, actually sharpened by the disagreement, was Jung's distinctive view, his own answer to the question of what the unconscious is made of. And his answer went like this. Below the personal unconscious, below the layer of forgotten mournings and repressed griefs and charged complexes organized around your own life's particular sorrows and hopes, there is another layer, a deeper one. And this one is not yours alone. Jung called it the collective unconscious, not collective in the sense that people consciously share it, like a public library anyone can walk into. Collective in the sense that it is not derived from individual experience at all. It is, in Jung's word, inherited. Inherited not as specific memories or specific images, but as a structural disposition, a readiness, a set of molds into which experience pours itself. Every human being, Jung proposed, is born with this layer already present, the way a bird is born already knowing the shape of the nest it will one day build, even though no one taught it. Imagine, if you will, that the mind is not simply a house with one lit room and a cellar of one's own accumulated things. Imagine that beneath the cellar there are deeper foundations, old foundations, stone old, and those foundations connect, through rock, through earth, through something too deep to see, to the foundations of every other house. The personal unconscious is the cellar you filled yourself over years. The collective unconscious is the bedrock beneath shared, structural, ancient. What lives in that bedrock? Not memories, not events, not the specific shapes of anyone's particular life. What lives there are forms, templates, predispositions to organize experience in certain recurring ways, to respond to certain situations: birth, death, the mother, the father, the stranger, the hero, the great turning moments of a human life, with patterns that appear reliably again and again across every culture humanity has ever produced. Jung called these patterns archetypes. The word comes from Greek, archos, meaning original or primordial, and typos, meaning a stamp or model. An archetype is an original form, a first impression. But here is where Jung made a distinction that is easy to miss and quietly important. The archetype itself, the archetype as such, the thing that actually exists in the collective unconscious, cannot be seen directly. It is not an image, it is more like a tendency, a pressure, a readiness to form a certain kind of image when the right conditions are present. It is the mold, not the casting. It is the empty form that experience fills. What we can see, what appears in dreams and myths and stories and works of art and religious symbols, are archetypal images, the specific shapes the mold produces when it is filled by a particular culture, a particular moment in history, a particular person's life. The archetype itself is universal and invisible. The archetypal image is particular and visible. Jung offered a beautiful image for this, one that I find very useful for holding in the mind late at night, when precision is less important than feel. He compared archetypes to the axial system of a crystal. Before a crystal forms, there is no crystal. There is only a solution, a liquid, or a gas. And within that medium, an invisible structure. The axes along which the crystal will form when conditions are right. The axes determine the angles, the geometry, the lattice. They determine that a snowflake will have 6 sides, not 5 or 8. They determine the shape of a salt crystal, the shape of quartz. But the axes themselves cannot be seen. They are not made of matter. They are a kind of mathematical predetermination, a formative tendency built into the medium. And then, when conditions are right, the crystal forms. It follows the invisible axes exactly, but each crystal is different. The same underlying geometry produces an infinite variety of actual forms. Every snowflake different from every other snowflake, and yet every snowflake recognizably, unmistakably a snowflake. That is what Jung meant by the archetype. The axial system, the invisible, inherited structure, is the archetype as such. The actual snowflake, the specific dream image, the specific myth, the specific symbol a culture reaches for to represent the mother or the hero or the underworld, that is the archetypal image. Universal form, particular expression. And so when a child, never having studied mythology, dreams of a great serpent that speaks wisdom from underground, and a medieval monk 2,000 miles and 500 years away carved the same great serpent into the stone of his monastery, and a woman in Tokyo in the 20th century draws it in a therapy session without knowing why. This is not coincidence, and it is not influence. It is the same axial system producing the same approximate crystal from the same inherited depths. That was Jung's claim. It remains, as claims go, a large one. He was careful to say that archetypes are a theoretical construct, not a proven biological mechanism. The evidence he pointed to was cumulative and comparative, the consistency of certain themes and images across cultures that could not have communicated with each other, the spontaneous appearance of mythological motifs in the material of patients who had not studied mythology, the reliability of certain patterns in dreams. Whether the collective unconscious is literally a shared psychic inheritance or a very good metaphor for something more complex remains a question that neither neuroscience nor psychology has fully settled. Jung himself held it as his best available description, not as dogma, but as a map, as a way of understanding why certain stories feel ancient the first time you hear them, why certain fears seem older than your own life, why the images that arise in grief or in joy often resemble the images that have arisen in grief and joy since the earliest human records. As a map, it has a kind of illuminating power that is very hard to dismiss. Let us rest here again, gently. You may notice as you lie there that you are already carrying something tonight. Some feeling or some image or some question that does not quite have a name. Perhaps it came with you when you lay down. Perhaps it rose up in the quiet of the last few minutes. Whatever it is, however large or small or clear or formless, you do not need to do anything with it now. You do not need to understand it or resolve it or follow it anywhere. If anything in what we have been walking through tonight, the house, the lit room, the complexes forming below in their charged constellations, the idea of something deeper still, something shared and old and structural, if any of it has touched something in you, let it touch. You do not need to name it. You do not need to remember it in the morning. The things that genuinely reach us have a way of staying without our help. Take a slow, easy breath. Let the weight of your body settle. When you are ready, we will walk a little further. Now, I said that the archetype is the axial system, the invisible inherited form. But I want to stay with this a little longer because it is easy to hear it and think, inherited from whom? Through what? How does a predisposition get passed from one generation to the next, if not through specific memory? Jung's honest answer was that he did not know the mechanism. He was not a neurologist. He was not proposing a biological theory of gene transmission. What he was proposing was something more like a structural observation, that when you look at the deepest material arising from the psyche across human cultures, across time, across individuals with no knowledge of each other, you find recurring patterns that cannot be explained by individual learning or cultural exchange. And that the simplest available description of this phenomenon is to say that the human psyche comes equipped, structurally, to produce certain forms. He was not claiming to have opened the skull and found the archetype sitting there. He was mapping what appeared in the material, in dreams, in symbols, in the imagery of psychosis, in myth, and tracing the recurring shapes. The map does not require the mechanism to be true. The mechanism can remain, for now, a matter for future sciences to investigate or to disprove or to reframe entirely. What matters for tonight, for our slow walk through this house, is the architecture. That there are these two layers, the personal unconscious, which is yours, specific to you, filled over the years of your particular life, organized into the complexes that the galvanometer at the Burghölzli could detect in the slight trembling of a delayed response, and the collective unconscious, which is not yours alone, which you share with everyone who has ever drawn a story from the dark, which is built into the structure of the psyche the way the axial system is built into the crystal, one layer above the other. The lit room of the ego floating on the personal unconscious floating on the collective resting on something. Call it the bedrock, call it whatever word sits quietly enough not to disturb you. That may be the oldest thing in us. You did not put it there. No one taught it to you. It was already present when you arrived in the world, the way your bones were already present, in potential, in the first weeks of forming. Not yet solid, but already mapped. There is something almost comforting in that if you let yourself feel it, that you carry something ancient, that the images that rise in your dreams are not random noise, but something organized by a very old intelligence, the same intelligence that organized the dreams of people who lived 1,000 years ago and will organize the dreams of people not yet born. You are, in some sense, a part of something much larger than your own story. Jung spent much of his life working to understand what that larger thing was. He never finished. He was 65 when he said that the problem of the psyche was the central problem of our time, and he kept working until he died at 86. The Red Book, the private record of his own descent into the collective unconscious, written in his own hand, illustrated by his own drawings, kept in a locked box, was not published until 2009, nearly 50 years after his death. He seemed to feel that some maps are too personal, too unfinished, too strange to release during a life. And perhaps he was right. Some things need to settle before they can be shared, but we will come to the Red Book a little later when we have more of the map in place. For now, let the image hold. The house. The lit room where the ego stands, small and certain and purposeful. The lamp turned up bright. The hallway beyond, where the personal unconscious begins. The forgotten rooms, the things stored away, the complexes sitting in their corners like old furniture charged with memory. And below all of that, through the floor, down into the foundations, the place where the house stops being yours and becomes something shared. The bedrock of the collective unconscious, the crystal lattice, the axial system that generates, in every person who has ever lived, the same deep forms, the same approximate snowflake. This is the territory, and we have only just begun to walk it. In the rooms ahead, and we will reach them quietly, without hurry, there is a mask hung by the door which Jung called the persona. There is a shadow in the corner of a room you may prefer not to enter. There is a stranger who lives somewhere in the house, whom Jung described as a bridge, as an inner figure who knows the way to the deeper levels. And at the very center, at the place the house curves back into itself, the quiet circular room at the heart of everything, there is what Jung called the self. But not yet. For now, let the image of the house, the island in the wide sea, the crystal and its invisible axial form, let them sit with you. They do not require your attention. They will be there when you come back to them, and you do not need to come back to them at all. Let the sea be the sea. Let the house be dark and quiet. Let the crystal, somewhere in the deep foundation, take whatever form the night gives it. You are already inside the map. You have been inside it all along. There was a man in Zürich in the early years of the 20th century who sat across from his patients with a stopwatch in one hand and a list of words in the other. The room was quiet. A galvanometer sat on the desk, a device that measures the skin's electrical conductance, which rises almost imperceptibly when the body is afraid or startled or trying to hide something even from itself. Jung would say a word, a simple word, table, mother, money, death, and he would wait. Most words came back quickly. The patient said chair, and the patient said white, and the needle barely moved, but sometimes, not always, not predictably, something happened. The answer came a half-second too late. Or the patient stumbled, said the wrong thing, said nothing at all, and the needle moved. He was not catching liars. He was not looking for guilt in any legal sense. He was watching for something quieter and stranger than that. The places where the mind hesitated, where the smooth surface of ordinary conversation suddenly had something underneath it pressing up. He called those places complexes. The complex, as Jung defined it, is not simply a problem or a neurosis, though those words have absorbed the term and made it smaller than he intended. A complex is an emotionally charged cluster, a knot of images, memories, feelings, and associations, all organized around a single core experience or theme. A mother complex, an inferiority complex, a complex around money or failure or being seen. Each one sits in the personal unconscious like a room with its own furniture, its own particular quality of light, its own tendency to make noise at inconvenient moments. What made Jung's observation so quietly stunning, and what the stopwatch and the galvanometer were there to demonstrate, is that the complex does not wait to be invited. It arrives. A word is spoken in ordinary conversation, and something in you reacts before you have decided to react. The body knows. The pause gives it away. The answer comes out sideways. He said something about this that has stayed with people ever since, though it is worth saying slowly so it lands rather than slides past. He said that it is not so much that we have complexes as that complexes have us. Sit with that for a moment if you are still awake enough to sit with anything, not that you have them, that they have you. The complex is not a possession you carry like a stone in a pocket. It is more like a small, autonomous figure living in the house, one that can, on certain occasions, take the wheel. You meant to respond calmly to that particular subject, that particular person, that particular kind of moment. And instead, something else spoke. Something faster than your intention, older than your considered opinion. You stepped back into yourself a moment later and thought, where did that come from? It came from the cluster. from the room in the house that you did not consciously enter but that entered you. This is what made Jung's early work empirical, grounded, measurable, repeatable. The stopwatch was not a prop. The galvanic skin response was not mysticism. This was a man watching the body document what the mind had not yet admitted. The reaction time, the stumbled word, the faint electrical signature in the skin. These were data. They pointed to something real and structured inside the person, something that could be inferred from the outside, even when the person had no access to it from the inside. It is a gentle corrective to a misunderstanding that follows Jung around still. He is sometimes painted as a visionary who dispensed with evidence and wandered off into myth and symbol. And later in his life, his work did venture into territory that is harder to verify. Synchronicity, the deeper archetypes, the invisible structures of the collective. We will come to those quietly, without rushing. But the beginning of his career was this: a man in a clinic with a list of words and an instrument, discovering that the self is larger and stranger than the part that answers questions. He was not yet 40 when he met Sigmund Freud. Take a slow breath if you like. Let the image of the galvanometer, the stopwatch, the hesitating patient, let all of that settle the way water settles after you have placed something gently into it. There is no hurry. The house is not going anywhere. And when you are ready, we will continue together. Freud was already famous, 20 years older, the founder of psychoanalysis, a man whose name had become attached to a way of seeing the human mind that was reshaping medicine, literature, and ordinary private life. The unconscious as a repository of repressed wishes, mostly sexual in nature. The slips, the dreams, the symptoms, all of the messages from a basement where the mind had locked away what civilization would not permit. Jung had read him, had been struck by him, had written to him, and Freud had written back. And in 1907, the two men met in Vienna for the first time. They talked, by some accounts, for 13 hours. Freud, it is said, saw in Jung a kind of ideal successor, a younger man who could carry the work forward, who was not Jewish and might therefore bring psychoanalysis into circles where Freud's own background had made entry difficult. He called Jung his crown prince. He spoke of him as the man who would inherit the movement. For several years they were close, collaborating, corresponding, presenting together. Jung edited a journal. He traveled with Freud to America. He was, by any outward measure, the designated heir. But something was quietly not resolved between them. Something about the shape of the unconscious itself. Freud believed the unconscious was primarily a container for repressed material, drives, wishes, memories, pushed below the surface because they conflicted with the demands of conscious life and social morality. The libido in Freud's framework was specifically sexual energy. That was where the pressure came from. That was what the dream disguised, what the symptom dramatized. Jung did not disagree that repression was real, or that the unconscious existed, or that it could press up into life in exactly the ways Freud described. But he began slowly to feel that the container was too small, that the unconscious was not only a receptacle for what the individual had pushed aside, that it held something older, deeper, and not personal at all. The break came around 1912 and 1913, and it was painful in the way that the end of a close intellectual friendship is always painful. Not only disagreement, but the loss of a trusted mind, a particular kind of intimacy. Jung published Transformations and Symbols of the Libido, in which he reframed libido not as specifically sexual energy, but as psychic energy more broadly, a generalized vital force that could take many forms. Freud received this as a fundamental rejection of the ground on which the whole edifice had been built. They exchanged difficult letters, and then, mostly, silence. They did not reconcile. What Jung went on to build in the years following the break was something that required a different map of the underground. Beneath the personal unconscious, beneath the layer that holds your own forgotten things, your own complexes, your particular knots of feeling and memory, Jung proposed that there is another layer entirely, not personal, not derived from anything you have lived or forgotten or repressed. He called it the collective unconscious. The image that helps most, and that we touched on when we first entered the house, is the sea. Your personal unconscious is the near depth, the water just below the surface of this particular stretch of ocean, shaped by your own weather and your own shore. But beneath that, far deeper, is a layer that does not belong to you specifically. It is the ocean floor, the bedrock, the place where your sea and every other sea in the history of human life shares a common ground. The collective unconscious is not acquired. You did not accumulate it through experience, the way you accumulate a complex or a preference or a skill. It is inherited, structural, present in the architecture of the psyche before a single experience arrives to fill it. And its contents, the patterns that live there, the forms that recur, Jung called archetypes. Now this word has traveled far from what he meant by it, and it is worth taking a moment to be precise. An archetype in Jung's sense is not a character, not a picture, not a symbol. It is not the wise old man as an image or the great mother as a painting. The archetype as such, the thing that actually lives in the collective unconscious, is more like a structural tendency, a predisposition, an invisible readiness to produce certain kinds of images, to organize experience in certain ways, to feel the pull of certain meanings. He reached for an analogy that I find quietly beautiful. Think of a crystal, not the finished crystal, not the particular snowflake or the particular quartz formation, but the axial system, the invisible lattice that determines, before any material arrives, the angles at which the crystal will grow, the geometry it will follow, the form it will take. The lattice is not the crystal. You cannot see it or hold it or point to it, but without it no crystal forms. And every crystal that forms from this particular lattice will have recognizable family features, even as each one is different. The archetype as such is the axial system. The archetypal image, the specific figure of the wise old man that appears in your dream, or the particular shape of the great mother in a particular culture's stories, or the specific hero with a specific name in a specific mythology. That is the crystal, the visible, culturally particular form that the invisible structure generates. This is why, Jung believed, a child who has never encountered Norse mythology can still dream of an old man who gives dangerous gifts. Why the figure of the terrible and tender mother appears in the stories of cultures that have never touched. Why the hero's journey, departure, ordeal, return, transformation, seems to arise independently in stories told on every continent, not because the stories were copied from one another, but because the axial system was already there, waiting to shape whatever material arrived. Every snowflake is different, the crystal lattice is the same. Let that rest if you like. Take a slow breath. Notice wherever your body has softened against the surface beneath you. The shoulders, perhaps, the hands, the place behind the eyes where the day's busyness has been quietly releasing its hold. The house is still here. The lit room, the hallway, the deep foundations. Somewhere in the bedrock, the axial system turns, slow and silent, generating its forms. You did not choose it. You did not learn it. You carry it the way you carry the capacity for language. It's not any particular language, not any particular word, but the structural readiness to speak. You have been carrying it your whole life. It has been shaping things you thought you chose freely. And knowing this, or even just resting near the idea of it here in the dark, changes nothing you need to do tonight. It is simply the shape of where you live. The house is deep, the sea is wide, and you are already, without effort, already home inside it. And so we come to the doorway. Not the grand entrance of the house, not the deep foundations we have just been resting near, but a smaller particular door, the one that faces outward. The one you open every morning before you step into the world. Hung beside it, just inside the frame, is a mask. Jung called it the persona. The word comes directly from the Latin. It is what the actors of the ancient Roman theatre wore on stage, the large carved and painted face held up before the crowd, the mouth open so that the voice might pass through. Personare. To sound through, the mask through which the voice speaks. And so the persona, in Jung's map of the mind, is the face we learn to present to the world. Not necessarily a false face, not a deception in any simple sense. It is, rather, the adapted self, the particular shape of personality that has been worked and reworked across years of living with other people, shaped by their expectations, by the roles we are asked to fill, by the slow, gentle, and sometimes not so gentle pressure of the society we move through. You have one. You have always had one. And it is not something to be ashamed of. From childhood, we learn that certain things we feel and think and want are welcome in the world, and certain things are not. We learn that in this particular house, with these particular people, it is safe to be curious, but perhaps not safe to be angry. Or that tenderness is valued, but uncertainty is not. Or that strength is expected and softness must be kept quiet. And so gradually, over the years of growing up, we assemble a face for the world, a way of being that can move through the day. A version of ourselves that is, in a real sense, genuinely us, and yet is also unmistakably a costume. Jung did not think the persona was a problem in itself. He was not asking us to strip it away or live without it. That, he felt, would be neither possible nor desirable. We are social creatures, we live among others. The persona is the necessary mediator between the interior self and the demands of the world outside, a kind of ambassador standing at the door, speaking the language the world understands. A doctor, he noted, must carry something of the doctor about them when they enter a consultation room. A teacher brings the teacher into the classroom. A parent holds the parent steady when a child is frightened in the night. These are not performances in any cynical sense. They are real adaptations to real situations, and they serve a genuine purpose. The persona is, in this way, a form of social skill, a learned and necessary grace. But there is always a but somewhere in the house. Jung's concern was not the mask itself. It was what happens when a person begins to mistake the mask for the face. He had a particular way of describing this. He spoke of people who become, as he put it, possessed by a role. Not in any supernatural sense, but in the very ordinary, very common sense in which a person who has spent decades being a professor becomes unable or unwilling to step outside that role even for an hour. The professorial manner, the habit of authority, the expectation of being heard and deferred to, these cease to be something worn and become something lived from the inside. The mask has grown to the face. He saw it in colleagues. He saw it in himself at times when he was honest. He saw it in patients who came to him in the second half of their lives with a particular and recognizable distress, the sense that they had been enormously successful at being what the world expected them to be, and yet there was something hollow at the center of it. Something unlived. Something that had been waiting a very long time. Because here is what the persona does not contain. Here is what it cannot carry by its very nature. Everything that did not fit, all the feelings that were too difficult, too dark, too tender, too strange, too contradictory to present to the world's audience, all the aspects of self that were quietly set aside in the long years of assembling the social face. The persona is, by definition, selective, and everything it leaves out has to go somewhere. It goes to the shadow, but we will walk there slowly. First, let us rest here a moment. At the door with the mask. Think of the faces you have worn today. The professional manner, perhaps, or the cheerful one, or the capable one. The one that says, I have this under control, even on the days when you were not entirely sure you did. None of these are lies exactly. They are ways of navigating the world that you have practiced until they come easily. They are you, and also not entirely you. There is nothing wrong with any of it. The trouble comes only when the gap between the mask and the face is no longer visible even to the person wearing it. When you have been the role so long and so completely that you have forgotten there was ever anything else. When someone asks very gently, "But what do you actually want?" and the question produces not an answer, but a long, bewildered silence. Jung believed that this silence is not an absence, it is a direction. It is the persona pointing, in spite of itself, toward everything it has been covering. Take a slow breath here. Just let that rest for a moment, softly. The mask is not the enemy, but it is not the whole face. And somewhere in the house, deeper in the rooms that do not open to the street, the rest of you is waiting. When you are ready, we will continue. Let us take a slow, deep breath together. Notice the weight of the body, whatever surface is holding you tonight. Notice that the hands have let go of whatever they were holding. The breath moves in, and the breath moves out. You do not have to do anything with this. You do not have to fix anything tonight. The house is still here. The door is there with its mask, and we are going deeper. Beyond the door, down the hallway, past the familiar rooms, there is a part of the house that does not face the street. It does not receive visitors. It is not kept neat for company. And it contains, among other things, everything the persona has ever quietly declined to carry. Jung called it the shadow. The name sounds ominous, and in the popular imagination it has become something frightening. The dark twin, the inner monster, the secret evil that must be wrestled into submission or sealed behind a locked door forever. This is not what Jung meant, not even close, and getting this wrong, he felt, was one of the most costly mistakes a person could make. Because if you spend your life trying to defeat or destroy the shadow, you are spending your life in a war against yourself, and you will lose simply by fighting. The shadow, for Jung, is the part of the self that we have not consented to be, the aspects of our character. And this includes weaknesses, yes, but also strengths, drives, intensities, needs, whole dimensions of feeling and wanting that were judged at some point to be unacceptable, too much, wrong, not allowed. And because the psyche cannot simply destroy what it does not like, it puts it somewhere, it moves it to the edge of consciousness, and then gradually, below the edge, into the personal unconscious, into the shadow. The shadow is not, in Jung's understanding, a separate self. It is the same self, but the parts of it that have been pushed to the back of the room, covered over, explained away, projected outward. Projected. That word is important, because one of the most consistent and characteristic things the shadow does, and this is the mechanism Jung found both fascinating and sobering, is appear in other people. You have felt it, probably. The sudden, disproportionate irritation at someone you barely know, the person at a gathering who does something quite ordinary, and yet it produces in you a response that is somehow too hot, too charged, out of proportion to what they actually did. or the quality in someone else that you find yourself judging with a particular sharpness, a harshness that startles you a little if you notice it, a contempt that runs deeper than the occasion seems to warrant. Jung would have said, look there, not because the other person is blameless. They may have done something genuinely unkind, but the charge, the heat, the disproportionateness, the sharpness that belongs to you, that is your own disowned material, moving across the room and dressing itself in someone else's body so that you can finally see it at a safe distance. We meet our shadow again and again in the people who irritate us most. And this is not comfortable knowledge, it is not flattering. It requires a particular kind of honesty that is one of the harder things in the world. To sit with the feeling of sharp contempt for someone else's weakness and ask very quietly, where in me have I refused to allow this? To feel the sting of someone else's arrogance and ask, in what rooms of my own interior have I locked away a self that wanted to be seen? These are the questions, Jung felt, that begin to dissolve the projection, not because they immediately answer themselves, but because the act of asking them returns the charge to its true owner. And then something interesting happens, because the shadow, you see, does not only contain the things we are ashamed of. This is the part of Jung's thinking that surprises people. This is the part that does not make it into the simple summaries. This is the gold. He believed, and he stated this clearly, that the shadow is not simply a repository of the inferior and the rejected. It is also a repository of the unlived, and the unlived is not always shameful. Sometimes it is luminous. The person who was told early in life that their imagination was impractical, and who learned obediently to set it aside, may find their creative capacity living in the shadow, waiting. The person who was raised to be serious and composed and who armored themselves in competence may find that a huge, tender, weeping, laughing aliveness is still there, unbroken in the dark. The one who has spent a lifetime being reliable may find that a wild, wandering, completely unscheduled self is sitting in the shadow room, perfectly intact, playing. This is what Jung meant by gold in the shadow. The work, then, is not to destroy the shadow or to be conquered by it. It is to go into the room and look around, to pick up what is there, examine it in the lamplight, and ask without flinching, is this mine? Did I set this down? Can I carry some of it back? Integration, not conquest, that was his word, and it was chosen carefully. He was aware, of course, that this is not comfortable work. He did not pretend that meeting the shadow is easy, or that its contents are uniformly pleasant. There is genuine material in the shadow that is simply destructive, impulses, resentments, capacities for cruelty, and acknowledging these requires courage, not to act them out, but to see them clearly enough to stop pretending they are not there, and in that clear-eyed acknowledgement, to gradually withdraw their power. The shadow that is seen directly cannot ambush you in quite the same way. The irritation that is recognized as your own projection cannot quite so easily convince you that it lives entirely in the other person. The contempt that is traced back to a door you yourself closed long ago on something you needed, that contempt becomes something else. Softer, sadder, more honest. And slowly, the room opens. This is the first and most morally demanding work Jung associated with the inner life. Not because it is the only work, but because you cannot go further into the house until you have begun, at least, to look. The shadow is close to the ego. It is the near room, the one just off the hallway. You do not have to descend to the deep foundations to find it. You find it every day in the irritating colleague, in the quality you despise in your neighbor, in the thing you judge harshly in yourself. It is always close. and it is always holding something. Let us pause here. Take a slow, deep breath. Feel it arrive. Feel the long quiet of the exhale. You do not have to go looking for your shadow tonight. Not literally, not with effort. You do not have to excavate anything in this room, in this dark, with the weight of sleep beginning to gather at the edges. But if something has surfaced, some small recognition, some quiet "oh," let it just rest there without judgment. The shadow is not a verdict. It is an invitation. And the house has more rooms. When you are ready, we will go a little deeper. Past the shadow room, further from the lit corridor of the ego, there is another interior. One that is harder to name, harder to approach directly, and also, Jung believed, absolutely essential to any life that wants to be whole. Not the personal unconscious and its complexes, not the mask by the door, not even the shadow room, though we have visited all of these. Something else. Something that Jung came to call the anima in men, the animus in women, the inner other. This is where we need to walk carefully and slowly, because this part of Jung's map carries the marks of the world he lived in, a world with different assumptions about what it meant to be a man or a woman, about the fixed nature of those categories, about what belonged to one and not the other. Jung himself was a man of the early 20th century, and his thinking here carries that context plainly. We will take it as it was offered, and then we will say, briefly and without fuss, how many readers today choose to hold it a little differently. In Jung's original formulation, the anima is the unconscious feminine dimension of a man's psyche, and the animus is the unconscious masculine dimension of a woman's psyche. These are, in his framing, not simply inherited ideas about gender. They are something more specific, more structural. They are the inner opposite, the contrasexual figure, the aspect of the self that corresponds to whatever has been, in the course of a life, identified with the other. Where the ego says, "I am this kind of person," the anima or animus says, "and also this." Where the persona has been built from one set of qualities, the inner other is shaped from the remaining, the unlived, the ones that were declared by culture and by experience to belong to the other side. For a man who has spent his life developing a particular kind of rational, outward-directed competence, there may be in the depths of the psyche an inner feminine figure, sometimes appearing in dreams, sometimes experienced as a mood or an intuition, sometimes projected onto women in the outer world and experienced as love or fascination or incomprehensible irritation. This figure carries qualities the outer man has not fully claimed, receptivity perhaps, emotional permeability, the capacity to be moved without being swept away, a kind of knowing that does not travel through argument. For a woman who has built her life around relational care, warmth, and accommodation, there may be in the depths an inner figure of a different kind, carrying qualities of directness, of assertiveness, of the capacity to hold a position without immediately softening it to maintain harmony. Appearing in dreams sometimes as a man, or experienced as an inner critic, a voice that judges before the outer world gets the chance. This too is the animus, or one face of it. Jung believed these figures function as bridges, not obstacles, not enemies, not embarrassments to be hidden from the rational mind, but genuine intermediaries between the conscious self and the deeper unconscious. The anima or animus, when it is operating well, is how the ego finds its way into the lower levels of the house, past the personal unconscious, past the threshold of the collective. It is the figure who knows the stairs. When it operates poorly, when it is ignored, when it is projected entirely outward and expected to be filled by another person, when it is allowed to run wild in the interior, without any conscious relationship to it, it becomes something much more troublesome. The anima unmet becomes the tyrant of a man's moods, pulling him into states he cannot account for and cannot exit by reasoning. The animus unexamined becomes the inner critic that speaks with the voice of authority but offers nothing but condemnation. What Jung proposed in his concept of active imagination and in his clinical work was the possibility of turning toward these figures, of engaging them consciously as one might engage a figure encountered in a dream, asking them what they want, listening to what they carry, allowing a relationship to develop that is neither total identification nor total suppression. This is where many contemporary readers, with reason, choose to expand what Jung proposed. The strict binary, the fixed correspondence between a person's outer world gender and the nature of their inner contrasexual figure, does not map cleanly onto many people's lived experience. It was never meant to be a rigid rule so much as an observation about the way the psyche tends to compensate for what is consciously lived, and the deeper principle that there is in each of us something of the other, an inner counterpart, a bridge to the depths, a figure who is not quite the eye we show the world and not quite the depths we rarely visit. This principle, many readers find, remains true even when the specific architecture of Jung's original framing no longer quite fits, the inner other, the unlived opposite. The figure in the dream who points without speaking toward the corridor you have not yet entered. Call it what fits your own interior. The function is the same: to mediate, to bridge, to say gently and persistently, there is more here than you have been willing to look at. And in that willingness to look, something begins to shift in the whole structure of the house. Not suddenly, not dramatically, slowly, the way the light changes in the hour before dawn, so gradually you cannot name the moment it happens, but you become aware at some point that the room is different than it was. Jung noticed in his clinical work and in his own interior life that this kind of engagement with the inner figures was not a project that could be completed in a season or a year or perhaps even a decade. It is the work of a life. And it belongs, he thought, particularly to the second half of a life, to the years after the great outer work has been done, after the persona has been established and tested, after the first shape of the life has been laid down. We will come to that in a little while. The full map is almost complete. But first, let us pause again. Take a slow breath. In through the nose, slowly, if that feels comfortable. And out again, long and easy. Let the body settle a little further into whatever is holding it tonight. You have been walking through a great interior space. The lit room where the ego holds its lamp. The hallway of the personal unconscious with its complexes. Those emotionally charged clusters that arrived before you had words for them, that carry the history of what once was too much to hold consciously. The deep foundations where the collective inheritance waits not as memory, but as structure, the axial system turning in the bedrock. The mask by the door, social and necessary and sometimes forgotten to be a mask. The shadow room where the unlived waits, not only what is difficult, but also what is luminous, the gold that the persona set aside in the long work of becoming presentable. And now this, the inner other, the figure at the threshold of the deeper rooms, the bridge. So much of a life happens without any of this becoming conscious. And that is all right. Most of us move through our days with the lamp of the ego, and the persona by the door, and the shadow trailing behind us, and the inner other surfacing in dreams, or in the people we love most intensely or most inexplicably. This is the ordinary texture of an ordinary life, and it is not a failure. But there is another possibility. That is what the rest of the house is for. Let yourself drift a little, if you are beginning to. The breath is slow and even, the house is very quiet, The next room is the one at the center of everything. Jung gave the self a capital letter, which is worth noticing. He used it to set it apart from the small self we usually mean. The self who is tired tonight, who made a mistake last week, who is trying to remember what they were supposed to do tomorrow. That small self is the ego. The self, the large one, is something different. It is the center of the whole house, not only the lit room. Let us walk toward it slowly. The ego, you will remember, is the part that says I. It organizes the day. It plans and decides and judges and names things. It is necessary. Without it, there is only dissolution, a mind without a bank to hold the river. Jung was not interested in dismantling the ego, which is a thing some people misunderstand when they first meet his ideas. A strong, reasonably humble ego is not the problem. It is the precondition. You need a lamp to walk through a dark house. But the ego can make a certain mistake. It can conclude that the room it stands in is the whole house. This is where the persona enters. The word persona comes from the Latin, the actor's mask. In the Roman theatre, the mask was not merely a costume, it was a technical instrument. It projected the character, amplified the voice, told the audience at a glance who was speaking. The mask was useful, the mask was necessary. Nobody in the back row could see an actor's face. They needed the mask. We wear masks too, we always have. There is the face we bring to work, the register we use with strangers, the version of ourselves that knows how to move through a formal room, the particular tone we find automatically when we speak to someone who is grieving. None of this is dishonest exactly, it is adaptive. Society asks us to show certain things and fold other things away, and we learn this early and learn it well. And the learning is not a wound. It is the ordinary work of living among other people. Jung called it the compromise between the individual and society. Something offered outward so that something inward could remain private or simply undisturbing to others. The persona is necessary, that is the first thing. The second thing is the warning. Because the mask, worn long enough, can begin to feel like a face. There is a particular kind of person. Jung sometimes named professions as examples: a doctor, a professor, a judge, someone whose role carries great weight and clear definition, who over the years becomes so shaped by the function they perform that they can no longer easily set it down. The role fills the hallway. The role comes home with them. The role is what they think of when they ask themselves who they are. And in the end, the question, who am I without this, becomes not just difficult, but frightening, because the self beneath the mask has not been tended. It has been waiting, but it has not been visited. Jung used the word possessed sometimes for this condition. Not possessed in any dramatic sense, simply occupied. The persona so large and so present that the living person inside it has been quietly crowded out. This is not only something that happens to doctors and judges, it happens to parents who have forgotten they are also people. It happens to caretakers who have not been cared for so long they have stopped expecting it. It happens to anyone who gave a role everything and asked nothing for themselves in return, year after year, until the role and the self became indistinguishable. The mask grew to the face. You can feel this sometimes in others. A rigidity, a quality of the person always performing even when there is no audience. An uncomfortable sense that if you ask them something genuinely unexpected, something off the script, they might not know how to answer. Not because they are unintelligent, but because the answer would have to come from somewhere the persona does not reach. And you may have felt something like it in yourself. A version of yourself you showed the world for so long you began to believe it was all of you. A face for the neighbors, a face for the office, a face for the family. And then late one night, a night something like this one, the sudden quiet question, but what is underneath? This is exactly the right question. The persona is not the enemy either. This is important. Jung was not asking us to strip the mask and live in a constant, unguarded rawness. That would be its own kind of problem. The persona serves. The skill is in remembering that it serves, in being able to hang it gently by the door at the end of the day, in knowing the difference between the role and the person who inhabits it. Take a slow breath here, in very gently, and out. Let the body know it does not have to perform anything right now. Whatever face you wore today, you can set it down. There is no audience. There is only the quiet house and the sound of your own breathing, and the rest of the rooms we have not yet walked through. You are not the mask. You have never only been the mask. Rest in that for a moment, and when you are ready, we will continue. Now, the shadow. If the persona is what we show, the shadow is what we hide, and more specifically, what we have hidden from ourselves. Every act of self-presentation involves a selection. To show this, I must not show that. To be seen as kind, I must not acknowledge the jealousy. To be seen as strong, I must not examine the fear. To belong to this family, this group, this version of who I am supposed to be, I must set aside the parts that do not fit the picture, and those parts do not disappear. They go somewhere. They accumulate over years and years into a presence that moves alongside us just outside the lamplight. The shadow. It is not only our darkness. This is one of the most important corrections Jung's actual thought requires of the popular shorthand. People sometimes assume the shadow is the wicked part of us, the suppressed violence, the ugly thoughts. And yes, some of that is there. We are not such simple creatures that we can have lived without accumulating some difficult things. But the shadow also holds what is bright. A girl who was taught early that ambition is unbecoming in women might carry her ambition in shadow, not because ambition is dark, but because it was rejected. A man raised to believe that tenderness is weakness might carry his gentleness there. A person told their whole childhood that they were not creative might carry, in the shadow, a richness they have never once touched. Jung called this the gold in the shadow. The integration of the shadow is not a process of making peace with evil. It is as much a process of retrieving the buried treasury, of discovering that the rooms we sealed off contain not only what we feared to be, but also what we have not yet allowed ourselves to become. This is a large thing, and it does not happen in a single night. But the beginning of it, the very beginning, is a simpler movement. It is noticing projection. We meet our shadow most readily not in ourselves, but in other people. This is Jung's observation about how the psyche manages the material it has not integrated. What I have not acknowledged in myself, I find maddening or compelling in you. The quality I judge most harshly in someone else is very often a quality I share and have not examined. The thing that stirs an inexplicable, disproportionate rage, not ordinary irritation, but something more electric than the situation warrants, that excess, that surplus of feeling is frequently a signal. Something of mine is in there, looking back at me from your face. This is what projection means in Jung's terms, carrying an unintegrated piece of the shadow outward into the world and finding it wherever you look. Not because the world placed it there, but because the psyche has nowhere else to put what has not been met at home. The antidote is not conquest. You do not defeat the shadow. You do not destroy it or suppress it more thoroughly. You turn toward it. You learn to see it. You bring it, slowly, carefully, in pieces, into the lamplight of the ego, not to be judged again, but to be known. Integration. The shadow does not become you, but you become more whole by including it. the house becomes larger by that much. The gold belongs to you. It has been waiting. Let that settle for a moment. Take a breath, soft and even. Notice whether anything in you shifted just a little, hearing that. And when you are ready, we go one room further. There is a figure here, or perhaps not quite a figure, more like a presence, a quality, something that arrives at the deeper threshold, where the personal becomes something harder to name. Jung called this figure the anima in a man, the animus in a woman. And because he was writing in the early 20th century, he framed it in the strict terms of his time, a binary, a masculine, and a feminine, each psyche carrying its opposite. That framing is his, and it belongs to its era, and many readers today, quite reasonably, find it too narrow for the actual range of human experience. What he was pointing at, though, that is worth keeping. The inner other, the unlived opposite. The part of the psyche that does not belong to the persona, does not live in the shadow exactly, but waits at the passage between the personal rooms and the deeper ones between what we know of ourselves and the vast architecture below. A bridge, he called it. A figure that mediates. And that much, whatever language we give it, seems to answer something real. So we have come at last to the deepest room. Not deeper in the way of darkness exactly, though there is darkness here. Deeper in the way that a tree's roots are deeper than its branches. Not hidden as a secret is hidden, but hidden as foundations are hidden because they are underneath everything else and the whole structure rests on them. Jung called this room the self. And here we must be very careful with a word, because it is a word we use every day and think we understand. When we say myself, we almost always mean the ego, the I that woke up this morning, that carries our name, that remembers our story and chooses what to have for breakfast. That is the ego. That is the lit room we began with at the start of this long, slow walk. The self is not that. The self, in Jung's map, is the center of the total psyche, not just the center of consciousness, the center of everything. The lit room and the dark hallways, the near depths of the personal unconscious, the vast shared floor of the collective unconscious below, the persona hanging by the door, the shadow in its corner, the bridge figures waiting at the passage. All of it, the whole house and the grounds it stands on, and the earth beneath the grounds. The self is the center of all of that. And the ego is, by comparison, very small. Think of it this way: you are standing in that lit room again, the one where you began. The lamp is on, you can see the furniture, the books on the shelf, the window, you know where things are. This is consciousness. This is the ego. You are here, and here feels like everything, because it is the only part you can see clearly. But then someone turns the lights on in the rest of the house, and you discover that the room you were standing in was one room among many, that there is a corridor you did not know about, leading to rooms you had not visited, that there are doors you thought were walls, that the house is much, much larger than the lit room suggested. And at the very center of this vast house, deeper than you thought the house went, there is a quiet, circular room. That room is what Jung called the self. He did not mean a room you can simply walk into on a Tuesday morning and stand in and say, well, here I am. He meant something more like a center of gravity, a point toward which the whole house is oriented, whether or not you have ever found it. The house has always been organized around this room. You may never have known it was there, but it was there. And this is the distinction that mattered most to Jung, the one he returned to again and again. The ego is the center of the field of consciousness. The self is the center of the whole psyche. One is the center of what we see. The other is the center of what we are. They are not the same thing. One of the most common errors in reading Jung, and a gentle correction is worth making here, in the quiet of this late hour, is the idea that the goal of all this inner work is to dissolve the ego, to let it go, to escape it somehow, as if the ego were a cage, and freedom meant destroying the cage. Jung did not believe this. A strong, stable ego is not the obstacle to wholeness. It is the condition for it. You need a self that can stand at the center of the lit room, steady and not be overwhelmed. Not by the complexes when they surge, not by the shadow when you turn to face it, not by the depth of the collective unconscious when it opens below you. The ego is the one who makes the journey. You cannot make a journey without a traveler. What individuation asks is not the destruction of the I, but its expansion, its willingness to relate to all the other rooms, to acknowledge them, to gradually include more and more of the total psyche in what it knows and holds. The ego must loosen its claim to be everything. That is very different from disappearing. Now, the self had a symbol, or rather, the self seemed to produce symbols of itself again and again, across cultures, across centuries, across individuals who had never met and could not have taught each other. The mandala. You may know the word, or you may know the shape without the word. The circle, divided and organized, often with 4 sections or 4 gates, symmetrical, centered on a central point. Buddhist monks draw them in colored sand, grain by grain, over days, then sweep them away. Medieval Christian illuminators placed them in the borders of sacred manuscripts without always knowing why. Indigenous traditions around the world had their own versions of this shape, and in Jung's consulting room in Zürich, patients who had never seen a Tibetan tanka, who had never stood in the nave of a cathedral and looked up at the rose window, began spontaneously drawing circles, divided circles, centered circles, mandalas. Jung himself drew one every morning, he said, for a time. He found that the shape of it corresponded to something in his inner state that day. He came to believe that the mandala was the psyche's own image of itself in its wholeness, that the circle with a center was what the total psyche looked like when it attempted to picture itself. The circumference holds everything, and the center is the quiet point from which the whole is organized, the self. There is something very still about that image, a circle, a center, no beginning, no end, moving around itself, everything equidistant from the still point at the middle. Jung proposed, and this is his theoretical model, not established neuroscience, let us hold it lightly, and let it be beautiful, that archetypes arise from the collective unconscious as inherited predispositions, as the lattice of the crystal determining the form of the snowflake, each snowflake different, and yet all of them obeying the same invisible geometry. And of all the archetypes, the self is the deepest and most encompassing, as the archetype of wholeness itself, the inherited predisposition not just to produce this or that pattern, but to move toward integration, toward completion, toward the circle with a center. It does not happen quickly. Nothing in this house happens quickly. Let us rest here for a moment in this quiet, circular room. Take a slow breath. Let your body settle a little further. You do not need to understand any of this tonight. You do not need to arrive anywhere. You are already inside the house. When you are ready, we will continue. There is a little more to tell, and it is gentle and it is interesting, and you may carry it or you may let it drift. Either way is fine. Jung spent his long career, and it was a long career. He lived until 1961. He was 85 years old. He kept working almost to the end, building out the rooms of this map. And along the way, he made several other observations that are worth naming briefly before we gather everything and let you rest. One of them concerns personality, the way people differ in their basic orientation to the world. In 1921, Jung published a book he called Psychological Types. It had been a long time coming. He had been trying for years to make sense of something he kept observing, that some people seemed to gather their energy from the outer world, from other people, from activity and engagement, while others gather their energy from within, from reflection and solitude and the interior life. He named these two tendencies introversion and extroversion. Those are his words. They have since passed so thoroughly into the general language that most people use them without thinking of Jung at all, which is, in its way, a sign of how thoroughly the idea took hold. But he did not stop there. Alongside these two attitudes, in the direction of attention and energy, he described four functions, four modes of perceiving and responding to experience. Sensation. The function that perceives through the senses directly what is concretely there. Intuition. The function that perceives indirectly through hunches and possibilities, and the thing that is not yet there but could be. Thinking. The function that organizes experience through logic and analysis, asking what things are and how they connect. Feeling. The function that evaluates experience through value and meaning and relationship, asking what things matter and what they are worth. Jung believed each person had a primary function, in the one they used most naturally, the one that came first, and a secondary one to support it, and then, opposite to the primary, a function that was weaker, less developed, often running in the unconscious rather than in the lit room of consciousness. The superior function and the inferior function, the developed and the less developed, the bright side and the side that needed to grow. It is a rich framework and it has been used, adapted, reinterpreted. Here, a very small correction is worth making, quietly. You may have heard of the Myers-Briggs type indicator, the personality test with its 4 letters, the one that appears in offices and team-building exercises and the bios of people who are very sure they are an INFJ. That test was influenced by Jung's typology, yes, substantially influenced, built in part on the very ideas we have just been describing. But it was not made by Jung. It was created by 2 women named Catherine Cook Briggs and her daughter, Isabel Briggs Myers, who worked on it across the middle of the 20th century, long after Jung had moved on to other things. He did not design the test, did not administer the test, and died before it was widely used. The idea is his, loosely. The instrument is theirs. It is a small thing, but it is the kind of small thing that in the quiet of a late night, it is pleasant to have straight. Now let us linger a moment on 2 images that belong to the later, more personal, more interior Jung, active imagination. This was a practice Jung developed partly through his own experience, partly through his work with patients. The idea is something like this. Instead of waiting passively for the unconscious to speak, in dreams, in symptoms, in those strange mood shifts that arrive without a story, you could also turn toward it deliberately. You could sit quietly and attend to the images that arose and let them develop and even speak to them. Ask them what they wanted, let them answer, not hallucinating, not pretending. Something more like what a very honest, very patient writer does when a character in a story begins to say things the writer did not plan. You sit with the figure, you let it move, you enter into a kind of conscious dialogue with what the unconscious is producing. Jung did this himself for years during one of the most turbulent periods of his life, after the break from Freud, when he felt genuinely unmoored. And he wrote down what he saw, he drew it, he illuminated the pages carefully, with colors and symbols and figures. He kept these writings private for almost his entire life. They passed into the care of his family. For nearly a century, almost no one outside his closest circle had seen them. In 2009, as nearly 50 years after his death, the book was finally published. He had called it the Liber Novus, the New Book. But most people now know it as the Red Book, for the color of its heavy leather cover. It is extraordinary to look at all those hand-lettered pages, those carefully painted figures, the record of a man who had built a detailed map of the human psyche and then descended deliberately into his own interior to test it against the reality he found there. He was, among other things, a very brave person. And then there is one more idea, a later one, something Jung developed in his 70s, partly in conversation with a physicist named Wolfgang Pauli, who happened to be one of the great minds of quantum mechanics. Jung called it synchronicity. He defined it as a meaningful coincidence and a causal connection between events, a pairing that is not explained by cause and effect, but by significance. You are thinking of someone you have not thought of in years, and at that moment, the phone rings, and it is them. You are struggling with a decision, and you open a book at random to a passage that speaks exactly to what you are facing. Nothing caused it. But the meaning hangs there, undeniable. Jung thought this was a real phenomenon, that the psyche and the outer world were occasionally capable of a kind of resonance that could not be explained by the usual chains of cause and effect. Wolfgang Pauli, for his part, was interested in coincidences in the history of scientific ideas, moments when two scientists working in complete isolation arrived at the same discovery at the same time. Whether synchronicity is a genuine feature of reality, or whether it is the pattern-making mind doing what the pattern-making mind always does, finding meaning, weaving connections, perhaps seeing them where they are not, this is genuinely contested. Jung believed in it. Many scientists do not. Many ordinary people recognize something in the idea and are not quite sure what to do with it. In the late quietness of this hour, perhaps that is the right way to hold it, not as fact, not as fantasy, but as a question that is interesting to carry lightly like a smooth stone in a pocket. And here is one more thing to carry. There is a line attributed to Jung. It appears in many places, it is quoted often, it captures something true, but it cannot be traced to a specific text, a specific page, a specific speech. So I offer it as a paraphrase, as something that sounds very much like what he meant without claiming it is his exact word. Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate. Whether or not those are precisely his words, they are precisely his idea. The unconscious does not wait to be invited, it acts. Through the complex that hijacks your reaction before you have understood why. Through the shadow, you project onto the stranger who bothers you. Through the pattern you repeat in relationship after relationship without quite knowing you are repeating it. Through the persona you have worn so long that when someone asks who you are beneath it, you find you are not sure. The map Jung drew was not drawn to frighten, it was drawn to orient, to say, here is what is in the house with you. Here are the rooms, here are the figures. You do not have to be afraid of the size of it. You just have to be willing to look. That willingness is itself the beginning of individuation. Let us breathe for a moment, slow, easy. The house is still. The lamp is on in its room. The rest is quiet. And when you are ready, or perhaps you are already beginning to drift, and that is perfectly fine, that is exactly right. Let us talk about individuation itself. The last thing, the shape of a whole life. Jung used a word with an interesting history, individuation. It comes from the Latin indivisus, undivided. To individuate is not to become more separate, more self-contained, more concerned with yourself and less with others. That would be individualism, and Jung distinguished them carefully. Individualism is a kind of shrinking, pulling away from others to protect the ego. Individuation is a kind of expanding, growing large enough to include more and more of what you actually are, until the gap between the ego and the self begins, slowly, to close, becoming undivided. He believed this process was not confined to youth or to the early years of building a life. In fact, he thought the work belonged especially, perhaps primarily, to the second half of life. The first half of life has its own imperatives: finding your place in the world, building the persona, the social face that allows you to function, developing your strongest functions, your most reliable capacities, establishing a life. And all of that is necessary and right. But the persona built for the first half is not built for the second. The persona protects the young person navigating society. For the person who has been navigating for 30 or 40 years, it can become a constraint, a mask that has grown too tight. And the shadow, accumulated quietly through all those years of building the proper face, sits in its corner with all its unlived potential and its unprocessed grief and its rejected gifts. And the complexes run their patterns, and the deep architecture of the collective unconscious pulses with its ancient rhythms. At midlife, or sometimes earlier, sometimes later, sometimes in a crisis that arrives without warning, something shifts. Jung called it sometimes a crisis of meaning. The things that organize the first half no longer organize the second. The identity that felt solid begins to feel like a costume. The questions that youth did not have time to ask begin to press. Who am I beneath the role? What have I not lived? What is asking, quietly, to be included? And the work begins. Not dramatically, necessarily. Not always in a therapist's office or a monastery. Sometimes simply in the willingness to sit with what is uncomfortable, to notice the projections and draw them back, to look at the shadow with curiosity instead of revulsion, to let the inner other, whatever name you give to that bridge figure, lead you a little further into the house, room by room. The house does not change. It was always this large, but you are moving through more of it. And as you do, the lit room, the ego, gently expands. Not by conquering the other rooms, but by entering into relationship with them. By including them in the story of who you are. At the end of that journey, if a journey like this has an end, the ego and the self are not the same. They are never the same. The part can never be the whole, but they are, as Jung sometimes put it, in dialogue. The ego knows it is not alone. It knows the house is large. It moves through the house with something that is not quite certainty, but is perhaps the next best thing. Orientation, groundedness, the sense of a center you can find your way back to, the quiet circular room, the mandala. Not a destination you arrive at once and stay in, more like a room you visit, more like a point you orient toward again and again across the long arc of a life. Jung himself spent his long life making this journey. He was, by his own account, not a finished man. He was a man in process, still mapping, still asking, still sitting with the figures that came to him in dreams, in images, in the strange overlaps of inner and outer that he called synchronicity. Still drawing, in his last years in the tower, he built himself by the lake at Bollingen, stone by stone, with his own hands over the course of decades, adding rooms as he felt ready for them. The tower at Bollingen was, in some sense, a physical version of the map. A house he built slowly from the outside to match the house he was exploring slowly from the inside. Each new room added when a new room was ready. He did not finish it until he was very old. And then let me gather everything now gently and bring it to rest. We began tonight in a house at night with a single lamp lit in a single room. That room is the ego, the part of you that says I, the center of consciousness, the familiar self that carries your name and your memory and your voice. It is real, and it is necessary, and it is also not the whole house. Below it, in the near depths, lies the personal unconscious, everything your particular life has accumulated and set aside, the forgotten and the repressed, the half-perceived, the things too painful to keep in the light, and the things simply too numerous to hold at once. They are not gone, they are there. And in the personal unconscious live the complexy, those emotionally charged clusters that have a life of their own, organized around a core of feeling that can reach up into the lit room and pull the furniture around before you have understood what is happening. A man at Burghölzli with a stopwatch and a galvanometer found them. They are real in the most empirical sense Jung ever worked in. They are the places where the hidden self flinches. Beneath the personal unconscious, deeper still, lies the collective unconscious, that vast shared floor that is not yours and not mine but belongs to all of us. The inherited dispositions, the structural tendencies that produce the same great patterns across every culture that has ever existed. And those patterns, those invisible crystalline lattices that shape every snowflake differently but according to the same geometry, those are the archetypes. Hanging by the door of the house is the persona, the face you present to the world, the mask that is necessary and useful, the one the Latin theatre borrowed from and which Jung borrowed back. Wear it well. Remember, it is a mask. And in the corner, in the shadow, the part of yourself you turned away from, the rejected and the repressed and the too much and the not good enough. And in that shadow, gold. Not only darkness, not an evil twin to defeat, but a part of yourself that has been waiting with some patience to be seen. Integration is possible. The house gets larger every time you let in what you had locked out. At the threshold between the personal and the deep, a figure waits, call it the inner other, the unlived opposite. Whatever language fits the particular shape of your life. It waits at the passage and knows the way further down. And at the center of all of it, past the lit room and the near depths and the deep floor, and the mask and the shadow and the bridge figure, at the very center of the whole house, there is a quiet, circular room. No corners. A center you can feel. That is the self. Not the ego, not the I of the morning, but the regulating center of the total psyche, the archetype of wholeness, the thing the mandala has always been trying to picture, the circle that holds everything, and the movement toward it, the long, slow, lifelong movement through the rooms of the house, gathering more of what you are, becoming less divided, less at war with your own interior. That is individuation. The second half of life, and perhaps the first, and perhaps all of it, organized toward that center. Jung spent 85 years mapping this territory. He used a stopwatch and a galvanometer, and he used words, and he used the painted pages of a red leather book he kept private for nearly a century. He broke with the man who had called him his crown prince, because he saw the house as larger than that man believed it was. He built a tower by a lake, room by room, with his own hands. He drew circles. He was trying to tell us, you are larger than you think. The part you know is the lit room. There is so much more house. You do not need to explore all of it tonight. Tonight you have simply walked through, lamp in hand, and seen that the rooms exist. That is enough. That is, in a way, everything. You do not need to remember any of this. If one image stayed with you, the lit room, the island in the sea, the shadow holding gold, the quiet circle at the center, let that be the one. Let it settle in wherever it settles. The rest will be there if you come back for it. The house will be here. It always has been. take one last slow breath. Feel the weight of where you are lying, the particular pressure of this particular night, your body settled and your breath easy, the sounds of wherever you are soft and distant. You are in the lit room, and the rest of the house is quiet around you. And somewhere far below the personal and the personal below, in the deep shared floor where the patterns live, something ancient and round and patient holds the whole of it in its circle. You are in it. You have always been in it. Sleep now, the house keeps watch. Enough stories for one night. Off to sleep now, Grandpa says.